Chapter 10. The Flow Cycle. By now, it should not come as a surprise that Waitzkin found himself in a flow state, but he first moved through what Herbert Benson, the Harvard cardiologist, describes a series of distinct, identifiable stages. In our words, the flow cycle. This brings us to a fundamental misconception around the state, namely that the state works like a light switch, on or off. You're either in the zone or you're not. Scientists describe the nature of the flow state as transient or unsteady. In our words, the state is just one stage in a four-part flow cycle. The first stage begins with a hard mental or physical struggle. The second stage, which directly follows the struggle stage, has been described as letting go or releasing tension. The third stage is the flow state itself. And the fourth and final stage in the cycle is recovery, or as Benson calls it, returning to a new normal. The following graph is helpful to visualize these four stages. But as you perceive it, remember this: flow arises from highly complex neurological, biochemical, and physiologic interactions, and cannot be captured into two-dimensional diagrams, or even in technical language. It would be like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. But despite these limitations, the picture should provide you with a better understanding of the flow cycle. The better you can understand this cycle, the better you can move through it efficiently and delicately. The cycle can be found in any field of endeavor, from business to scientific research, to religious discipline to sports. Specific biological and neurochemical responses will accompany these stages, as we are about to see. For example, in the struggle phase, this may include increased blood pressure, heart rate, and brain activity like the release of cortisol and norepinephrine. In contrast, during the release phase, nitric oxide is being released, which causes the mind and body to quiet down and to open a way for a flow experience. The flow phase itself causes dopamine, endorphins, and anandamide to flow into the system. And the recovery phase is accompanied by the release of serotonin, oxytocin, and allows the body and mind to deeply recover. Let's dive deeper into the different stages of the flow cycle. The struggle phase. Even though flow is always a positive experience, it starts with an unpleasant phase called struggle. Herbert Benson, who did much of the fundamental research on this cycle, chose the name for a reason. Struggle is a loading phase, writes Benson in his book The Breakout Principle. We are overloading the brain with information. Furthermore, there are two types of struggle. One, struggle that begins voluntarily with an act of will. Two, a struggle that is imposed involuntarily, usually by outside events. In the second situation, you don't have a choice whether to deal with a problem, such as in the case of the loss of a job, family tragedy, divorce, spiritual crisis, community disaster, and other circumstances as a result of external events. Both situations can potentially bring a person into a flow experience. But, as this falls out of the scope of this book, I'll continue with the struggle with an act of will. The voluntary struggle phase usually comes from extensive preparation, intense training, or complex problems at work, and other circumstances that will put you under stress. For a business person, Benson tells us, this may be concentrated problem analysis or fact gathering. The serious athlete may engage in extensive and demanding physical training. The person on a spiritual quest may plunge into a concentrated study or intense prayer or meditation. Regardless of how the process begins, significant stress will be involved in the early stages. In struggle, profound chemical changes occur. Stress hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine are pumped into the system. Tension rises and frustration as well. Our problem seems unsolvable, our effort unsustainable, and the whole situation feels as far from flow as one could get. Emotionally, we feel the adrenaline as fear. It's the fight or flight or freeze response. How we handle these negative feelings is critical. Either you embrace the struggle, which equals flow in the long run, or resist the obstacle by quitting. Until that happens, we feel stressed and uncomfortable. To move through struggle takes a leap of faith and a belief that the stress will help you enhance your performance. By definition, this demands a growth mindset. Take a moment to look at the two mindsets below and consider which set of statements you agree with more strongly. Mindset 1. Stress is harmful. Experiencing stress depletes my health and vitality. Experiencing stress debilitates my performance and productivity. Experiencing stress inhibits my learning and growth. The effects of stress are negative and should be avoided. Mindset 2. Stress is enhancing. Experiencing stress enhances my performance and productivity. Experiencing stress improves my health and vitality. Experiencing stress facilitates my learning and growth. The effects of stress are positive and should be utilized. Of these two mindsets, stress is harmful is by far the most common, says psychologist Kelly McGonigal in her book The Upside of Stress. While most people can see some truth in both mindsets, they still view stress as more harmful than helpful. If you're like most people, it's the stress is harmful mindset. This is rooted in what researchers call the mismatch theory, the mindset that our evolutionary adaptive fight or flight response was helpful when we were evading saber-toothed tigers. But this doesn't have a place in our modern society. Helping you shift your mindset to see how stress can enhance your performance is, of course, the essence of this part of the book. If we go back to Waitzkin's story, we see how the battle to stay focused and pressure of the world championship brought him into struggle. All our psychological war, recalls Waitzkin. We were 3 hours into battle, and I had been thinking for 20 minutes. I had been grinding my way through this game. It was the first round. I had no flow, no inspired ideas. The pieces were alien, the position strange. Of course, even if a player has logged in extensive hours of practice, he or she may still have a bad game. But the struggle phase will put the players in a much stronger position to experience the flow state, as the experience of Waitzkin demonstrates. But to move out of struggle and into flow, you must first pass through the second phase. Release phase. Release means to take your mind off the problem, and this is a crucial part in the flow cycle. Why? Remember the Yerkes-Dodson law? Stress must increase to a certain point if you hope to achieve your optimal performance. But after that certain point, the stress hormones become counterproductive and even harmful. Or, as Benson says it, when you've wrung the maximum benefit from the good stress that your body has generated, you must escape the influx of bad stress. Otherwise, the overflow of norepinephrine and other fight-or-flight hormones will drag you down into mediocre performance and perhaps damage your health. To further facilitate our discussion on the flow cycle, I've revised the flow cycle diagram so you can easily see the role of the releasing. To get into flow, you'll need to make your escape from the downward spiral. This may raise a couple concerns. For starters, how can we tell when we've reached the top of the Yerkes-Dodson bell curve, where the stress has begun to work against us? An effective subject test, Benson tells us, is an inner shift from feeling a good edge and forward momentum in your work or thinking to sensing that the pressure is beginning to work against you. Warning signs may include excessive anxiety or fearfulness, anger, a tendency to cry, frustration, a block on creativity, or physical symptoms such as headaches or backaches. Okay, that's clear, but how do we make our escape from the destructive stress? Nothing spectacular here. If you've been cramming for a test or deadline, soak in a tub or listen to your favorite music. If you're a nature lover, walk in the woods or wander at the seashore. If you've been trying to master double-back diamond ski slopes, take a few runs down the blues. If the innovation team has been pulling all-nighters, send them out for dinner and a movie. The method is unimportant. The message is release tension, or, as Benson describes, completely sever prior thought and emotional patterns. How long should the releasing phase be to be effective? The release phase's duration varies and depends on the intensity of the struggle, but the general thinking is about 10 minutes and preferably 20 minutes. But if getting focused is hit or miss, how can we give up our focus when we finally got it? My answers are to redefine the questions. Not only do we have to learn to let go of our concentration, but we also have to be really good at it. Conditioning to the insecurity starts young. As children, we might be told to concentrate by parents and teachers, and then be corrected if we look off into the clouds. So, the child in us learned to associate not focusing with being bad. The result is that we concentrate with everything we've got until we can't withstand the pressure and have a meltdown. I sometimes blew myself out with intensity during a game, recalls Waitzkin. In my early scholastic days, chess tournaments were long and exhaustive, but my dad and I were very good at preserving my energy. Most of my young rivals had coaches who treated tournaments like a military camp. Teachers and parents would make kids analyze their game extensively between rounds, trying to wring a chess lesson out of every moment, while I would be outside having a catch with my dad, or taking a nap. Maybe it's no accident that I tend to surge at the end of tournaments. My pops is a clever guy. And his dad had it all right. As it turns out, researchers discovered that the key to expanding capacity and pushing beyond one's ordinary limits is to seek short moments of recovery. This is what researchers describe as rhythmic wave oscillation. And as we're about to see, it represents the fundamentals of long-term success and fulfillment. Let's look at the science of stress and release and how we can benefit from it. Stress and release. In the previous chapter, I told the importance of the releasing phase within Benson's flow cycle framework. Now I'd like to briefly discuss it from the perspective of performance psychologists Jim Laird and Tony Schwartz, who ran a performance training center called the Human Performance Institute, HPI. At HPI, they discovered a clear psychological connection when it comes to the ability to release tension and recover from mental exhaustion. By the time I first went down to HPI, recalls Waitzkin, it was already becoming a mecca for athletes who wanted to hone their performance. I remember it clearly. After a few hours of conversation in which I described my life, career, and current issue, Laird sat back and asked me whether or not I believed the quality of a chess thought process was higher if it was preceded by a period of relaxation. This simple question led to a revolution in my approach to peak performance. That evening, after a long day of eye-opening sessions with Jim Laird, I sat down with my laptop and chess notebooks and spent a few hours looking over my previous year of competitions. It led to the discovery of a very interesting pattern. Looking back over my games, I saw that I had 2 to 10 minute crisp thoughts when I had been playing well. When I was off my game, I would sometimes fall into a deep calculation that lasted over 20 minutes. And this long thinking often led to inaccuracy. What is more, if I had a number of long thoughts in a row, the quality of my decisions tended to deteriorate. Our energy and recovery are our most fundamental need to perform well. Therefore, it's crucial to live like a sprinter. Break life down into a series of manageable intervals consistent with our psychological needs, with a periodic rhythm of stress and recovery. This is what Jim Laird and Tony Schwartz describe in their book The Power of Full Engagement as the time between points. As for performance psychologists, their goal was to understand the factors that set apart the greatest competitors in the world from the rest of the pack. Laird spent hundreds of hours watching top players and studying tapes of their matches. He could detect almost no significant differences in their competitive habits during points to his growing frustration. It was only when he noticed what they did between points that he suddenly saw a difference. While most of them were not aware of it, the best players had each built almost precisely the same set of routines between points. These included the way they walked back to the baseline after a point, how they held their heads and shoulders, where they focused their eyes, the pattern of their breathing, and even the way they talked to themselves. The psychologists discovered that the players who can relax in brief moments of inactivity are almost always the ones who end up coming through when the game is on the line. Remember Michael Jordan sitting on the bench, a towel on his shoulders, letting it all go for a 2-minute break before coming back in the game? Jordan was utterly serene on the bench, even though the Bulls desperately needed him on the court. He didn't even watch the other team's offensive strategies. The more he could let things go, the sharper he was in the next set. Imagine a tennis match going from the first set to the second, to the third to the fourth, and perhaps to the fifth. If I'm playing against you and I can squeeze in 20 seconds of rest after an intense burst of activity dozens and dozens of times while you can't, who do you think will be sharper at the end of the match? And therefore, of course, more likely to win consistently? Easy answer, of course. The one who knows how to oscillate. Same with our day-to-day life. These realizations are a good starting point, but how do we learn to let go on the free throw line in overtime of the NBA playoffs? Or in the moments before making a career-defining presentation? This is where the body and mind connection sets in. But first, let me share a personal reflection with you. A personal reflection. Surfing has always been an excellent ground for my rejuvenation and mental game. Floating on the water requires constant presence and the release of control. A surfboard is constantly moving with the sea, lurching beneath the body, and the only way to catch a wave is to sink into the rhythm of the wave and be ready for anything. At sea, I learned that virtually all situations can be handled as long as presence of mind is maintained. At the same time, it's easy to lose your calm when a 10-foot wave comes at you at 15 miles per hour, or when caught in the not-so-sexy impact zone. The impact zone is where my mental game snaps and brings me into struggle. I sometimes panic and make terrible decisions. I reach out too quickly for my board, get hit again sideways, or struggle to climb on top just as another wave crashes through, and getting caught between sets. Any poor decision in such a moment makes the impact zone experience even worse because it lasts longer, pushes you to the brink of your stamina, and sometimes breath capacity. When washed by the waves, you can only inhale when your face is not submerged underwater. Therefore, in surfing, it's increasingly important to learn when it's best to breathe and how to maximize your air intake. In those moments, I was forced to use my breath wisely, which brought me back to the now. Now, I make sure when I'm surfing, I maintain a calm inhale-exhale pattern, keeping it steady and rhythmic. Many surfers who are unsure of themselves in the water tend to panic slightly, even if they don't realize it, and alter their breathing patterns, hyperventilating themselves into exhaustion. Fail to navigate the impact zone in your vulnerable self, and you're washed by the sea. But if you strategize correctly and make the right moves that the moment calls for, you're safe and ready to ride the next wave. In fact, some of the best waves I caught were while recovering from getting smacked. The key here is a short, quick recovery. It turns a mess into a sleek performance. But the impact zone isn't just out there in the water. Sometimes, life just hits me, especially when I'm riding my dreams and my careers, relationships, and of course, out in the lineup. This requires that we learn to navigate through some challenging waters. Because if I'm not out there paddling, I'm on the shore watching, a bystander. And that's never where the action is. So, let's return to those strategies, because they're life-saving, energy-conserving, and smart to employ as much in surfing or any other sports. The mind-body connection. I've already mentioned the clear psychological connection between the ability to release tension and recover from mental exhaustion. What is more, physical flushing and mental clarity are very much intertwined. To be more precise, performance psychologists tell us that interval work is a critical building block to becoming a consistent long-term performer. So, suppose you spend a few months practicing stress and release in the physical area of your life. In that case, you'll lay the psychological foundation for releasing tension and better gateways to flow. Let's say you enjoy swimming laps in a pool. Instead of just swimming until you're exhausted and then quitting, push yourself to your healthy limit. Recover for a minute or two, then push yourself again. Create a rhythm of intervals and watch your breathing, like I described with surfing. With practice, increase the intensity and duration of your sprint time and gradually condense rest periods. This same pattern can be used with weightlifting. If you're doing 3 sets of 15 repetitions of a bench press, leave 45 seconds between sets, where you completely set your attention on your recovery by following your breath. Over time, you can increase the intensity and duration of the sets. For example, if you're doing 3 sets of 12 repetitions with heavier weights, you could do 50 seconds rest between the sets. And if lifting heavy weights, do 3 sets of 8 repetitions and take 1 minute rest between sets. The same patterns can be used for jogging, push-ups, sprinting, or any activity involving cardiovascular work. This will help connect your interval training to your mental arenas. The idea is to integrate certain stress and recovery patterns into our day-to-day life to be entirely natural for you when the struggle is on. And as we get better and better at releasing tension and coming back with a full tank of gas, both physical and mental, we will gain confidence in our abilities to move back and forth between concentration, adrenaline flow, physical exertion, any kind of stress, and relaxation. So, in conclusion, struggle gives way to release. Releases give way to flow. Hallelujah. But before we enter the next stage, give it a try right now. If you are reading these pages with a lot of tension, put the book down, take some deep breaths, and pick it up again with a fresh eye. Even better, make it a habit to do some physical exercises in the time between the points, such as push-ups, and try to focus on your breathing to lower your heart rate. Now that your conscious mind is free to take little breaks, you'll be delighted by the surges of creativity that will emerge out of your unconscious mind. You'll become more attuned to your intuition, and will slowly become more and more true to your own creative expression. The unconscious mind is a powerful tool, and learning how to relax under pressure is a key first step to tapping into its potential. Flow phase. Now we've arrived at the third stage in the cycle, the flow state itself. Since we already know what flow is, we will turn our attention to what prevents us from stepping into the state. Flow blockers is the term we're using. Let's have a quick look at those flow blockers. Negative self-talk. Negative self-talk can be a hard habit to beat. The process is like changing a bad technical habit in a sport. You need to identify the problem behavior, learn a more appropriate behavior, and practice this positive skill often to retrain the body to respond as you want it to. So the next time you'll be practicing your sport, pay attention to what you say to yourself throughout the day. Whenever you think about yourself, pay close attention to what you think about yourself. This exercise is not about eliminating the inner critic. It's about self-awareness. You will have an idea of how frequently you use self-talk and whether it's working for or against you. If you found you had lots of negative statements, see if you can come up with a positive statement. When you find yourself in a situation similar to one in which your self-talk has been negative, try saying the positive alternative instead. The ultimate goal with the skill of controlling your self-talk is to have it work automatically, every time you need it. This is the true test of mental skills. When you're under pressure, do your thoughts turn against you? Or do they come to your aid? Learning to speak to yourself in a positive way is another useful skill for improving confidence. Not optimal energy level. If an athlete knows she has not done the necessary training to be in good shape for an event, flow is unlikely to occur. On the other hand, being fatigued from too heavy training load is also recognized as a factor preventing flow. Finding a balance between too much and too little training is essential for both athletes and coaches. In addition, flow may not be equally easy to achieve through all the stages of a season, especially when training is periodized, due to the workloads that athletes carry when heavy conditioning is required and injury. The best way to cope with possible future setbacks is to make backup plans. You can plan for a potential repeat of situations and for new potential situations that may occur in the future. Knowing you have a backup strategy will boost your self-confidence and allow you to focus on the present moment. Lack of preparation. Sometimes athletes are well prepared physically, but fail in other aspects of pre-competitive preparation. What they do immediately before competition might be poorly organized, or they might not have set aside enough time to be mentally ready for the event ahead. Being unprepared can be a big stumbling block. Pre-competition preparations are important flow facilitators. Having a routine and following it is a great way to ensure mental readiness. Athletes vary in how they like to get ready for competition. For instance, some athletes feel more relaxed when they are alone before competition and focus inwardly. Although one sometimes cannot be isolated physically, it's still possible before an event to focus inwardly by, for example, focusing on the inhale and exhale of the breath. The more a pre-competition plan is rehearsed, the more automatic it will become. As a result, less analysis and planning will be required during the actual performance. Now, there is something you need to know before moving on to our final stage. The duration of a flow state varies from task to task. The same goes for intensity. For example, a flow state triggered by a 20-minute meditation session won't need the same recovery as a flow experience triggered by surfing, a soccer match, or a golf tournament. But in general, we can say that flow is an extremely expensive state for the body to produce and maintain. It requires a lot of energy and a lot of neurochemistry, and both take a little while to restore. And that brings us to the fourth and final stage of flow. Recovery phase. Just like struggle, recovery is another cycle step that doesn't feel flowy. Handling the massive delta between the world at your feet sensation that comes with flow and the utterly ordinary, all-too-human reality that shows up afterward is not always pleasant. There's no more feel-good neurochemistry, no more superhuman powers, and it can take a considerable amount of resilience to navigate recovery. Here, too, a growth mindset makes a difference. After experiencing flow, the person with a fixed mindset wants to take a unilateral credit for the amazing performance that came with that state. That's the basis of their self-esteem. If I can do that, then I must be that all the time. But we know by now that flow is a transitory state. So, when it leaves, the same person who took all of the credit for its presence is left with all the blame for its absence. For someone with a fixed mindset, that's often too much to tolerate. At the expense of health and relationships, they start seeking that high all the time, or self-handicap their performance with substance abuse, overtraining, and reckless decisions. And for fixed mindsetters, this isn't where problems end. To find flow again, the entire cycle needs to restart. This means moving from recovery back into struggle. But if you're stressed out from not being in flow during recovery, then getting fired up for serious frustration of struggle becomes a much more challenging task. This is where action and adventure athletes have another advantage, writes Kotler in The Rise of Superman. Recovery comes built in. Most of these sports are weather dependent. A big wave surfer needs big waves. Snowboarders prefer deep powder. Kayakers want specific wave levels to run rivers. These epic conditions do not show up every day. In their world, when the big storm blows in, everyone takes advantage. Then the storm passes, and it's time to relax. This built-in lag time creates space for rejuvenation. It allows athletes to build up reserves during recovery and prepare for the next round of struggle. This doesn't happen much anymore in sport competition. Rarely do we give ourselves permission to recover. In fact, in most of our lives, the reward for having a high-flow experience and pulling off something challenging in our sports is usually more intense training and less time to recover. At a high level, Waitzkin says, the chess world has many big games, and in long, grueling tournaments, they tend to follow one another, over and over, for days and weeks at a time. I know how to block out my issues in a sprint, but I run out of gas in marathons. Consistency became a critical problem. One day, I was inspired. I was unstoppable. But other days, I would play bad chess. It was time that Waitzkin learned the science of long-term peak performance. Managing energy. Our physical energy is the fundamental source of all other energies. Our physical energy comes from an interaction between energy expenditure and energy renewal. Both depend on our sleep and breathing patterns and quality of our recovery. Let's discuss some recovery strategies. The main choices are passive and active. Passive recovery is scrolling on the phone or watching Netflix on the couch. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, screen time disrupts the single most important source of recovery: sleep. This is because passive recovery keeps the brain active in an unusual way. For example, watching TV shuts down your higher cortical centers, which is usually good for recovery. But the constantly shifting images overstimulate the visual system, pulling the brain right out of alpha wave and into beta wave, which is the brainwave signature of awake and alert, as you might recall from part 1 of the book. Active recovery is the opposite. It ensures that the brain stays off and the body can rest. And equally important, It flushes stress hormones from the system by shifting from beta waves into alpha waves first, then delta waves. So, active recovery practices allow us to really reset. Research shows you can get really good at recovery in 3 simple steps. First, protect your sleep. Deep delta wave sleep is critical for recovery. It's when repair of the muscles occur. You need a dark room, cold temperatures, no screen time 1 to 2 hours before bedtime, and stop eating at least 3 hours before bed. Second, put an active recovery protocol into place, such as restorative yoga, stretching, long baths, or long walks in the woods. These are all traditional methods for active recovery. It is important that athletes experiment to identify the recovery options that work best for each individual. 2 to 3 days of active recovery can save an athlete 1 or 2 months of injury frustration in the long term. The third step is the total reset. Don't underestimate this step, especially if you're an athlete competing in competition. At the end of the season, take 2 to 4 weeks of almost complete rest. But it's important to stay active during that time. For example, if you're a soccer player, you need to recover from serious hits of the lower body, such as the ankle and knee. This gives a good opportunity to train your upper body, or enjoy other activities, like surfing or swimming. But there's no purpose in that activity, except for having fun. We had a look at the way of flow within the framework of Benson's flow cycle, and how mindset plays a huge role in tapping into the state. This is all accompanied by examples of sport athletes who have repeatedly used the state to accelerate performance. But between them and us, there are still a couple of milestones we need to cover. Therefore, in part 4 of this book, we'll dive deeper into the necessary conditions of flow, circumstances that create our entrance into the state. Flow triggers is the term we'll be using to describe these circumstances.